Hey guys, Zach here, and today I want to talk to you guys about 3 tank failures that I've made and how you guys can avoid them. First up for our tank error list is going to be this tank, and I believe it should be fairly clear what my mistake was on this tank, and it was just letting this algae grow and really get out of control. Now there are 2 things that I did that just did not halt the algae and let it go kind of out of control. The first was my lighting. I got very excited with this tank and I thought I had planted it more than enough. However, when I started to run lighting, I just ran it for way too long and way too bright, which gave the algae a ton of light and the plants just couldn't seem to compete with it, which ended up giving it enough that it could really start to take over the tank. Now, the second reason why the algae was able to really take over this tank was because I had a bunch of killifish and a couple of gouramis in here. They've since moved. However, with them being in here, I did feed the tank, and the tank just was not seeded enough and it couldn't take care of all of the waste, which ended up creating those excess nutrients that the algae was able to feed on and start to grow with. The way to avoid this mistake is to just control your lighting. I've said it before and I obviously forgot, but start off nice and low with a short duration of lighting, like 6 hours on a lower lighting, and see how your tank does, and then you can slowly, gradually work up, and that'll allow your plants to grow and also keep up with the lighting while not letting the algae get out of control. As for feeding, again, just portion out your feeding. Even if you have to skip a day or 2 of feeding, just keep it under control and ensure that the fish are eating everything that you are feeding, and that will stop excess nutrients from building up in your tank and getting a tank that looks like this. Tank 2 failure that really does sting is in front of you guys now, and it is the tree paludarium that I had just set up, but as you can see, it is dismantled. So let's get into why this was a failure. Now there are 2 main reasons why this tank failed. The first reason, as you can see, was actually this drop of water as it was coming down the side here. What I didn't account for was the rate at which the evaporation would happen from the falling water and how much you actually start to lose when you are running a tank like this. And because of how high the drop was, I was just losing water constantly, which really sucked, which meant I had to top it up often. But I don't know if that was also because of the second problem. The second reason why this tank was a failure was because in this bottom compartment there was actually a leak that was very slow, and it was slowly leaking water into the wood below. Now originally I thought it was just from the waterfall coming down, hitting the water, and some of it splashing out over time. But after I did turn it off, I found that I still had a substantial amount of water leaving the tank at nighttime when I wasn't looking, and it would slowly drain over the course of a couple of days. So obviously it was a very small leak, but it did drain, which was not good, and all of the wood underneath on the shelf was starting to get soaked, so I did have to drain the tank. Now, do keep in mind that before I put this tank down here, I did a water test after I siliconed this front panel on to ensure that I didn't have a leak, and after leaving it for a couple of days, I didn't notice any water leaking and the water level was still the same, so I thought I was good to go. However, I assumed that during the moving process I shifted the tank in some way or another, which might have created a small gap in the silicone, or even the older silicone on the back, maybe some form of leak formed there, which is unfortunate. However, it is all part of the process, and though it does suck, I did have to drain this tank. Now the question becomes, how do you avoid these problems? Well, the first way that you can avoid failure is in your aquariums, try not to use anything that is too big of a drop when using water features. An example of this would be down here in this tank where I still have running water, except the only difference is that it's nice gradual stair steps. You can see that I start up here and I slowly work down, and then it drops down to here, and then it slowly works down and eventually into the tank. However, this is a much more gradual, smooth, less surface agitation causing way of water movement, which means that this tank also doesn't drain as fast as the tank up top. This means that while having a nice water feature like this does look very cool, and I really enjoyed the noise it made and just the overall appearance, it does mean that this is a lot more work and you have to be much more on top of it. Now, if that is something that you are perfectly fine with, then I would say go for something like this. Now, the way to avoid the failure of having a leak in your tank is just to do proper water testing. I know I did one when I sealed it up outside. However, after moving it, I didn't do one because I thought I was safe. But as you can see, that was an oversight on my part. If I was going to do this again, which I probably will, I'm going to empty this all out and actually do a water test here on the shelf to make sure everything's all good. If there is a small leak, what I'm going to do is just re-silicone all the seams inside just to be extra super safe, and that'll just avoid anything like this happening in the future. Now, tank failure number 3 is one that I think is probably going to be the most common and one that can very easily be avoided. Failure number 3 that I'm talking about is this whole layer of moam that goes all the way across the bottom of my tank. You might think that these snails are on sand. No, they're on the moam layer, munching away on all of that dead organics. Now, moam itself is not a problem. It is a problem, however, if your moam layer does not grow and shrink as time goes on. Now, what I mean by this is a moam layer is always going to be in constant motion with the rest of a tank. There are times when it should grow a little bit bigger because maybe you have a plant dying off or a little more fish waste or whatever it may be in your tank, and that'll create more dead organics that all gather in the bottom like this layer of moam. But there are also going to be times when maybe all the plants are really thriving and they're taking up nutrients like nobody's business and slowly growing, which creates a smaller moam layer. As it does start to shrink, the plants will take in more nutrients, which means the moam should break down and eventually go into the substrate. So the moam layer should grow and shrink as your tank does evolve. However, my problem is this moam layer is just growing. It has not shrunk at all in the past couple of months. I've had this tank set up for a couple of years now, and I'm not foolish enough to think that, you know what, it's gonna shrink when I've got all of this dying Amazon sword back here. However, as a natural part of it, it should start to die off and add to the moam layer, but it does need to shrink eventually to when, let's say, this Amazon sword starts to grow again and produce those new leaves from those dying leaves. But this moam layer has not done that at all in the past couple of months, which means that there is something in the tank that has happened, which means that the nutrients are not being dealt with. Now, what could that possibly be? I have an idea, and it is probably because I've been taking plants out of this tank for the past couple of months. Now, the reason why I have been taking plants from this tank specifically is because it has done so incredibly well. This is a very well-established tank that grows pretty much any plant that I put in here. So what I'll do is I'll add plants to this tank for a month or two, let them grow out, and then I'll take them out and put them into new tanks. What this does is it allows the plant to grow and sort of establish, and I know it's a nice healthy plant before I add it into a new setup. It also means that some of the beneficial bacteria from this tank is going to start to colonize on the plant, which means I'm seeding the new setup with plants from established tanks, and this is very beneficial to the new tank. However, it seems that in all of this I have overlooked the fact that putting plants into this tank increases the amount of plant mass, which means more plants are able to take away from this moam layer without adding to it. And in the recent months, I haven't been adding any plants to it, just taking, which means this moam layer has started to build up as there's now more waste being produced than waste that is being used. So it's definitely an oversight on my part, and I know a way to fix this. Luckily enough, the solution to this problem is simple enough, and it is just going to be adding plants without taking plants out of this tank. And to do that, I've got a bunch of different tanks at my disposal, so I can take a small amount from each tank to add to this tank to ensure that this also doesn't happen to any of my other tanks. Now, that being said, I will be using stem plants for this because as these stem plants take the nutrients from the substrate, the beneficial bacteria start to work on all of this loam and all of this other nutrient that does seep into the substrate, breaking it down and allowing it to be used as nutrients for the plant, creating a nice cycle and restoring balance to the tank. That is everything for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you found the information in this video useful and it'll help you avoid these failures in your own tanks or even fix failures that could have happened in your own tanks. If you have enjoyed, please consider subscribing and I will see you guys next time. Peace.